If you've listened to this podcast before, you may have noticed that I often like asking people what their business models are. I mostly believe that in order to understand the incentives of a company or of any project, you need to understand how it makes money. Today's guest, Gorman, is someone who I've noticed is thinking about this a lot as he now works on his fourth startup. Sean is someone I admire a lot on how he thinks about which problems to tackle, having worked on mapping fiber optics infrastructure to making 3D models of the world, and he's now working on improving GPS accuracy with smartphones with his latest endeavor. Today's episode is about finding what to work on and gathering with like-minded people to execute on a vision. Today's episode is sponsored by Felt. Felt is a web tool that allows you to make collaborative maps. If you're familiar with how Google Docs or Notion work, you know about real-time collaborative documents. That's exactly what Felt is doing, but for maps. You can annotate, draw, comment directly on the map, and then send a link to anyone you wish to collaborate with. They also have invested in building their Upload Anything tool, a simple drag and drop from many spatial formats like shapefile, GeoJSON, GeoTIFFs, but also regular files like CSV or JPEGs. This effectively turns maps into a collaborative medium. They've also recently announced their QGIS plugin, so if you're used to working in QGIS, you can now easily import your projects into Felt and turn a QGIS project into a collaborative, easily shareable online project. If you want to give collaborative maps a try, head over to the link in the description to try out Felt. I'll also link to their YouTube channel that has constant walkthroughs of their most recent features. I like asking the same question every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. I'm quite curious, how would you describe yourself, Sean?
I guess, mapping enthusiast and accidental entrepreneur. And I've always really loved maps, even as a kid, and got pulled into it academically. And then the academic stuff kind of spun out into the private sector. And then I discovered I really enjoyed being an entrepreneur and building teams and starting companies. So those kind of been the two driving things. Like, we've always done mappy, spacey, spatial kind of things. And we've really liked doing it as a small team and trying to build something new and different. I think those have kind of been the two constant themes, at least in industry.
Yeah. What do you think, both for the mapping side and the entrepreneurial side, those things kind of go well together, but what do you think about each of those pull you towards them?
Yeah, I think probably the thing I enjoy most is building teams with friends. And the cool thing is, oftentimes you start building the team with friends that you've worked with before, and then as you add more people, you add more friends. And just building that camaraderie and teamwork it's like building a small family, and sometimes it becomes a big family. And I think similar to family, right? You see those people kind of graduate and go on to do great things. And that network of relationships and that you build over time working in, especially the geospatial community, I think is really addictive and fun. And I think spending the last 3 or 4 days in SAT camp really reinforced that, of just how much I enjoy the community and helping build a small part of it, and your insular way when you're trying to start a company. And I think, like anything that's hard and challenging and difficult, is that just builds the bonds that much stronger as you've kind of gone through the trenches together. And that process I just really enjoy and find very rewarding. And the fact that can do that around maps and geospatial, which is something that I've always really enjoyed, just makes it that much better.
What do you like about the maps and the geospatial stuff?
Yeah, I think it's visual. I've always been a visual learner. It was really funny, going through secondary school and learning mathematics, I had this pattern of alternating good grades and bad grades. And if it was algebra, I was kind of mediocre or very mediocre. And if it was geometry, I did better. And then when it went back to algebra 2, mediocre. But trigonometry, visual, did better. Calculus, really struggled. But for me, being able to see something, and if I can see something, I understand it much better. Similar, if I read something versus listening to something, I retain it much better. And maps are just this ultimate expression of visual data and computation and mathematics and these things that I really liked. But when it was abstract, I really struggled with it. But when I could see it, it made a lot more sense to me. And so maps was just this great embodiment of something that I struggled with, and maps made it easier. And especially early on, networks on maps was something that I was super excited and really liked a lot when I was an academic.
Yeah, you started in the academia, and you said you accidentally became an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I feel like that's probably a story I've told too many times. But I started off getting a degree in geography and then a master's degree in geography. Again, studying networks and largely was looking at digital divide. And there was this really cool history of quantitative geography around networks, studying railroads and transportation networks and what kind of impact they made on economic development and social inequality, and being able to go through and look at that mathematically, and then look at the social impacts and the qualitative impacts of that was just a really rich literature that I loved a lot. And so when I was learning about that, I was like, oh, that'd be so cool if, what are like the new networks that we could go and look at? And there had been some, more recent work on airline networks, which were really interesting because they were what they call non-planar networks. So you have planar networks where every time there's an intersection between two lines, there's a node, like a street. So every time two streets, unless there's like a freeway overpass, it's a new node. But with airlines, you just hop over everything and land at a place. And so in some ways, it kind of compresses distance in an interesting way. And it had a big impact as airlines came on board of how that shaped the economy. And at the time, I'll date myself, it was in the late 90s and the internet had come along. And so there was all these fiber optic cables that were getting laid. And they were also operationally, when you dig them, they're planar, but when you operate them, they're non-planar. And that, if I'm routing a packet, an email from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, it hops over to that next destination while the route may take a ziggy-zaggy across a bunch of right-of-ways. If you look at a routing table and a router, it's, and when you do, there's a thing you can do where trace routes where you send pings and you can see the names of the routers that come back. And usually a lot of times at least back in the day, they had airport codes. And so it'd be like IAD to Chicago to whatever the correct airport code is, to San Francisco, and you could see the way it hopped to get where it was going. And so you could kind of put these things on the maps. And so I got really interested in saying, what is the geography of the internet? What does it look like? Can we actually map it? Is it completely just cyberspace and like the Matrix, or is there a physical manifestation to it? And so that's why I spent the vast majority of my academic career studying, was seeing if you could quantify this geography of the internet and how much location mattered in that. Or at the time, like IBM would have these commercials of the end of geography and the death of distance. And I think actually the very first academic paper I ever wrote was maybe the death of distance, but not the end of geography. But that was kind of what sucked me into it.
Yeah. You told me earlier the story of kind of how you got some media press around some of that work. Could you tell me that again?
Yeah, so it was, again, it's these kind of serendipitous things that end up changing your life in ways you wouldn't expect. But when I finished, I was doing this master's degree at the University of Florida, and then I moved up to DC and tried getting a proper job for a while. And it was during the dot-com boom, and then there was a dot-com bust. And so I was like, ooh, that's scary. Let's go back to grad school where it's safe. So I went to George Mason, which is right outside of DC, to do a PhD in public policy. Ended up that public policy can get a lot more grant money than geography can, disciplinary. So a bunch of geographers just had like decamped public policy so they could get more funding for doing quantitative research, and that was the stuff that I was interested in. So I found this great group and joined up with them. And the second week of school was 9/11. And, was sitting at home waiting for the traffic to die down so I could drive into school, and you see it on TV. And that really changed a lot of stuff in the US at the time, and especially around infrastructure and networks. There became a big concern that if the target hadn't been a trade tower, but instead had been a nexus of network hubs. And there's a place called 60 Hudson Street that's a bit down the road and a few blocks over from the World Trade Center, and it moves a huge amount of the world's internet traffic. And so there's a lot of concerns that if it had hit there instead of the World Trade Center, would have taken down big chunks of the global internet. And so, George Mason being nearby and having a very well-known law school and public policy school, they got an earmark from Congress where basically they kind of slide in some earmark, or it was pork, is the kind of the American connotation for like sliding some free money into the legislation. And so George Mason got a big chunk of money to study critical infrastructure. And so we saw this and we're like, we have this big database of digital divide data that we've been collecting on fiber routes and how they operate and so forth. Maybe this is the kind of thing that they're interested in. But, we'd always looked at it from economic growth, social equity, digital divide, not how do you take it down.
Yeah.
And so it was a really weird thing to like try to think about it that way. But we wrote up a proposal and took some guesses, and myself and two other professors, Laurie Schintner and Raj Kulkarni, who were brilliant, wonderful academics that I had the privilege to work with. And they were much more seasoned than me. And I said, hey, I have this data. What can we do with it? And they had all sorts of brilliant ideas. So we worked and put together a proposal and sent it off, and didn't hear anything for months. And we're like, well, we gave it a shot, right? So we were off, and it was funny. My advisor was a guy, a gentleman named Roger Stow, and he was wonderful for like kind of giving you top cover and lots of room to operate. And basically, the deal when I came on board, and had this nice fellowship they had set up, and he said basically, yeah, for a year you can do what you want, and if you can find some funding within that year, you can continue to do what you want. If you don't find funding, you have to go on to one of the projects that is funded. And so it's cool. So so we're like
startup in academia.
And it was awesome because he also ran the entrepreneurship center for the university. So he was a wonderful person to work with. So I'm scattering around, hoping I can make my own destiny and find some money. Unfortunately, eventually what had happened was, they got the earmark, but they had no staff. And so they finally went out and found a director. And the director had come out of government recently, and he found our proposal somewhere in the pile of proposals. And he called up Laurie, the professor, and said, hey, can you guys come in? I'd like to talk to you about the proposal. And so she said, hey, Sean, somebody finally called back. I was like, yes. I mean, I might not have to go work on some random project. And so we went over across town to where the law school was and met with them. And basically it's like, hey, is this simulated data or is this like real data? Do you guys actually know where the fiber is in the ground? And we're like, yes. I mean, not exactly. We know it's on the road somewhere, but and he goes, great. He goes, can you guys do a few more slides to go with the presentation, like put together a little deck? We're like, yeah, sure, no problem. So we go back and we're on our academic ArcGIS licenses, and at the time this thing called ArcScene where you could do 3D maps. And so we started making these density maps of fiber to show where, and so it became like a 3D like little mountainscape. There was a mountainscape of where there was fiber aggregation or power lines. And so we look at like these interdependencies. And so we said, oh, that might be a cool way to show it. And then we came back and showed him the deck. He goes, perfect. We're going to go brief, like the NSA. And we're like, what? What do you mean we're going to go brief the NSA? He's like, yeah, they're really interested in this. And I can probably tell this story now. And I can't remember the order of who we briefed when, but the NSA one was particularly striking. One, because I'm a grad student. And what am I doing at the NSA? And then you go out, somewhere into the boonies of Maryland, and you go into a parking lot and it's nondescript, and, you go through gates and stuff, and you go into a special room, and we're showing them our mountainscape of fiber, and most of the places made sense. Like Silicon Valley and the Bay Area is a big spike. New York's a big spike with financial centers. DC is being an early home at NSFNet and having like MA East there is a big spike, and then there was this big spike in southern Utah. And we're like, what the heck's going on in southern Utah? But we're like, maybe it's like some bad data, right? Or maybe it's just like where a bunch of interstates happen to converge, which was also the case. And so maybe it's just a happenstance of right-of-ways and how you can get across the Rockies. And so we're giving the talk, and I can say this now because it's been publicly discussed, but they look at it and they're like, you need to remove that spike in southern Utah. we're like, what? They're like, yeah, we can't talk about it, but that needs to go away. Like, okay, erase the spike and just make it the same level as everything else. And since then, it's been publicly disclosed that NSA set a massive data center in southern Utah and was filling it with fiber, and had led a bunch of contracts to get a bunch of fiber piped in there, and it happened to show up in the data. And so, there's kind of these little things where we find these little nuggets or interesting things that either people didn't want you to see or didn't realize was publicly available. And so these agencies started to get a bit uncomfortable that, there was no security apparatus around us, random grad student and well-meaning professors that have, collected data from bulletin boards and horse trading with people who operate routers and telecom systems, or even municipalities that would give us the right-of-ways. And they said, well, how are you guys securing this? We're like, it's on the computer in Raj's office. and so about this time, there was a Washington Post reporter heard that, people were getting their feathers ruffled by random professors and grad student wandering around DC giving talks. And so they called up the university and said, hey, can we send a reporter out to hang out with y'all? And so the school's like, yeah, great, more press. Or any press. It's like, how often does academia get press? And so they're excited. And so the reporter came out and spent like 3 days with us. And it was interesting because she was her name was Lauren Blumenthal, and she was a lifestyle reporter. And she just switched from lifestyle to doing mainstream news. But she had a very lifestyle perspective about it. Like she wanted to know, what are you, what do you guys do in your free time? Where do you go for lunch? And like, she just wanted like context and flavor to it. So it made for a really interesting story. Although it was kind of ironic because she was, when we met, she goes, oh, I was really hoping you like live in your mom's basement and you had really thick glasses and you just spend all of your time like, scraping the internet to find, this, data that should be classified and so forth. But it's always funny, like tech stereotypes, or academic stereotypes for that matter, or whatever the case may be. But
yeah, because at the time, like, is that when you were like into competitive rowing as well, or is that a different time? Because you're definitely not that stereotype.
No, I mean, weirdly, arguably, I went to grad school so I could continue to train for rowing, which was a pipe dream I didn't have the physiology for, but really enjoyed. And so she actually went to practice with me, and she wanted to come down to the boathouse, and so that made its way into the article also in weird, kind of funny ways, and that like newspaper reporters interpret things that they see. But it was crazy, and it was like even had stuff of like she went and goes like, "Well, do you go on dates? Do you have a girlfriend?" It was funny, but it was so funny. She was lifestyle, right? That was the kind of stuff she was interested in. So it was like even though it was a tech story about national security stuff, it had all these like weird dimensions to it that were. It was just funny. I'd never done anything with media of any sort. But to come full circle on it, basically similar to when we put in the proposal for months, nothing, because, after like a couple of weeks, we're like looking at the Post and, still people back then had physical papers quite a bit. And so, we'd go down and leaf through and see if there's any check online and nothing. And then we kind of gave up. We're like, it's really not that exciting. It's fiber, right? Like it's in a ditch. And then like months later, and I'd actually, left and gone to the UK. And again, it was kind of a funny rowing thing. There was a race in the UK called the Henley Royal Regatta in the most British sense. And so I'd worked out a little junket with University College at London, where I had a good friend named Martin Dodge, who ran helped run the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis there. And I was like, hey, can we set up a trip where like I come for a week, and then like the week after I'll go do this race, or the week before, I can't remember what it was. And so Martin's like, oh yeah, we can work that out. So I talked to my professor, and he talked to his professor, and so we got it all greenlit and flew over. And so in the middle of that, after I think when I was like hanging out at Casa, and then it comes the story. Finally, there's like a slow news day, and it ends up on the front page of the Washington Post, and which was just stultifying and made no sense to us. And I didn't even know what was going on. Like like the professors are trying to find me and trying to track me down in London, and I'm too poor to have a cell phone, and it's early, and cell phones are kind of more expensive back then. And so, they have to physically like either get an email, but I have to be at a computer to check an email, or try to call up the lab and see if they can track down where I am. So it like literally took like a day or two to connect after the story to come out to even know that it had hit the papers. But in classic slow news day fashion, the TV media picked up on the print journalism, and so they called up and they said, hey, they want you to be on Wolf Blitzer. I'm like, CNN? And they're like, yes. I'm like, I'm in London. They're like, there's a studio in London for CNN. We're going to send a car. And I was like, what? And so they sent a limo. And so me and Martin got into the limo and went to CNN studios and was in, it's kind of funny. You see people like on the news, right? And there's always like a backdrop with all of like, the stuff going on. But most of the time, especially if you're not in the same room as the reporter, they put you in this little closet that has really nice mics like this, but you're in this like little closet with a backdrop or a green screen that they're faking something, so it looks like you're standing by Big Ben or something, and but it's very like kind of claustrophobic, and they wire you up, and like I hadn't brought like nice clothes, and so I'm like in shorts and a t-shirt or something. Completely inappropriate for being on television, and we did the interview, and but the title of the story was grad student's dissertation, security threat to the nation. And so, you can imagine what kind of questions you get in an interview with that headline. But and the snowball kind of went, I then, flew back to the US, and we did a whole bunch of, the whole junket of shows on, CNN and Fox and NBC and CBS, and even like Der Spiegel and a bunch of like European magazines and shows and so forth, which is wild. It's like, the classic 15 minutes of fame that Andy Warhol had. Like it was my 15 minutes of fame that made no sense. But yeah, that was kind of the weird media tour that completely came out of nowhere that we wouldn't have guessed.
And that's kind of where there's some work followed based on that media attention as well, right?
Yeah, and in the opportunistic fashion of American universities, they saw media trucks on the campus regularly. And I should say that we had a massive leg up by serendipity that one of the professors in the School of Public Policy had been an anchor on CNN and had retired and got a plush gig as a professor at a university, which was great in general, just to like get his perspective on global affairs as a student. But was really handy in this case in that, he says, hey, let me go talk to my friends at CNN and other people in the media. And so I don't think we would have had nearly as big of a junket if he hadn't been behind the scenes with like the dean and the vice dean, like saying, hey, let's get the school's name in the paper and help with recruitment and funding and other stuff. But the other kind of crazy thing was, it's like, you need some media training. So I went through media training, and then there was also like the security concern of, if people hear about this publicly, what if like some bad actor wants to like get in the middle? So we actually got like security training from like CNN's like security attaché, or I'm not sure what they were called, that like, told us all these funny things about like, don't drive home the same way every day. And it's like, it felt like, the thing that, like, don't run in a straight line if somebody's trying to shoot you. It's like these like weird things you would see like in a movie. And I don't know, it was all super surreal. But the university then sent in patent lawyers because people started calling up the university saying, oh, we want to license this technology we just saw on the news. And so they sent over the patent lawyers saying, all right, show us your inventions. And we're like, this we used ArcScene to make that little mountainscape of our fiber, and like there's some MATLAB code we were running simulations with. Like we had taken our hand at trying to like write some stuff faster in C, but it was so janky, and like there's a reason like I'm not the coder on any of our subsequent projects. I'm like I did it more regularly then, and I was bad, and I've only gotten worse. But we were like, there's nothing to patent, right? I mean, but eventually they found something, right? And so they filed a couple of patents, and then they come back and they said, so, do you guys want to license this out, or do you want to spin out a company? And we're like, ugh. Like, one, I don't want anybody buying this because it's kind of a load of crap. And there's nothing substantive here. And maybe there could be if there was some work. But also I'd planned on being an academic. Like I hadn't planned on like going to go be an entrepreneur. But the more we talked about it, we said, yeah, I mean, there probably is something cool. And we gotten grants to go and try to go like build some cool things. But it all needed work. And so I said, well, but the only thing that makes sense is to go start a company and see if we can build something and get some people smarter than ourselves that know how to build software involved, because it's certainly not us. And so that is kind of how we accidentally fell into the first startup.
How do you go from being a grad student to starting a company? Like the skill sets are very different as to what makes because you become founder of that company, probably with some others, but what makes a successful founder and what makes a successful grad student? There's maybe a little bit of overlap, but maybe not that much.
No, like the ironic thing is I remember like the first thing, well, I guess there's two things. Is one, I was very fortunate, and this kind of goes back to the rowing thing, that there was a gentleman who was a member at the boat club who'd won like the 1965 World Championships in the single. And it wasn't until 1997 that another American won. So he was a bit of this like icon within the sport. But similarly, he had he had rowed as he was in grad school, and he had gotten a PhD in physics at Columbia. And he'd similarly kind of used grad school and rowing to subsidize his training. And we'd just become friends over the years at the boat club. But also interestingly is the research that he did was about using lasers for printing. And so he had come up with an invention for instead of, back then in the late 60s, like beers all had like paper labels that were glued onto them. And he came up with a thing that would actually print onto the glass. And so it ended up spinning a company out of Columbia and grew it and took it public. And being a hardworking, self-driven kind of person, had made a big success at it. And then he had, when he retired from that, he went to the University of Maryland, and they started an entrepreneurship center called the Digman Center. And he'd run that for a while. And then that went really well, and they actually started a venture fund within the University of Maryland to invest in technologies that were spinning out of universities.
Right.
And so, I was, one day in the locker room, I was explaining to him, kind of what we were going through with the police. Oh, I saw this article in the Post. And I go, yeah, it's crazy. And unloaded all of the weirdness and told him to say, yeah, now they want to file patents. And he's like, oh, interesting. It's like, well, let's go get breakfast. It's like, that's a lot of what I do in my day job. And so he just started off pro bono advising us, and really did a huge amount of work to help us figure out how to navigate the university. And then Dr. Stow as well, running the entrepreneurship center, George Mason. Between the two of them, they helped craft getting the patents spun out in a way that allowed the company to be fundable, which is not always a given. A lot of times the university is so onerous with what they want for royalties on patents. And there was another complexity that they don't want to tell you necessarily, is that your dissertation, the IP belongs purely to the grad student. So we had to untangle what was my dissertation and what was federally funded research that under Bayh-Dole that you have to spin out as patents to the university. So there was some tricky things to navigate, and he did an amazing job, and Dr. Stow did an amazing job helping sort that all out. But eventually their fund ended up investing into it. And so a long way to get back to the first thing I told the fund was like, I have no idea how to run a company. It's like, we should get people in here that know how to run a company. And so they did they hired a headhunter and went out and found a CEO for the company. And then we got some additional investors, and we spun out and made a go at it and made a huge number of mistakes.
What do you start doing there?
What was my job?
Yeah, you.
I think I was, ironically, I think I was the CTO. As I said, I'm the worst coder possible, but I was the CTO. And so the first thing I did is was like, all right, we need somebody that really knows how to code. So let's go and find some people to do that. And before I'd gone to grad school, I had worked on some tech projects. And then with a small incubator that was meant to be, it was a bunch of former AOL people who had made a bunch of money at AOL and wanted to do an incubator for startups. and there was a group of us that were supposed to provide services to those startups. But then the dot-com collapse happened, and they're like, well, we don't have anybody to incubate, so you guys need to go find your own customers. And we did that for a while. Then we're like, well, and then they're like, you'll get paid, you'll have to pay yourself because we can't pay you anymore. So it's only what you make from your customers. And like, it was no longer like a functional kind of organization. That was about the time I went back to grad school. I'm like, this is foolish. I'm out of here. This entrepreneurial thing makes no sense to me.
So you go back to grad school?
After that, yeah, working that's when I went to George Mason. I was doing the incubator before.
Right,
Sorry.
Right. So you had to try it.
So I had a little bit of a network of people I'd worked with who actually knew how to code. And so I called up some of my friends and said, hey, do you know anybody that can come help us with this? And unfortunately, they made some really good recommendations and met some people and started bringing some engineers on board and growing the team.
Yeah, it's interesting because like some of the things that you're doing today, and when I talk to people around here that know you and have worked with you, it's not about the technical stuff. It's always about like everything around that people praise you for. But you're still in very, very technical companies. Like you've started a few companies, got acquired a few times, but he's on these very, very technical fields and topics. How do you put those two things together? And maybe one of the reasons I'm asking is sometimes you hear like you need to learn to code. Like if you can't code, you can't, like, don't even think about doing tech. Like it's this requirement that's needed. It kind of feels like you're a counterexample to that. I kind of want to deconstruct that a little bit and hear it from your point of view.
Yeah, I think it's always been, I think it's important to understand how code works. But not everybody has to be writing code as their daily thing. I remember there was like maybe it was apocryphal, but sort of like how Mark Zuckerberg wanted everybody at Facebook to code, and like even like the person in marketing had to know how to write HTML, and that like everybody was a coder that also did this other function. And I don't know if it's true or not, but I always thought it was interesting because it was like it just it's like not everybody's good at the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. And it always made sense if you're building a team, right? You want to have the right people for the right job. And even in grad school, it was like Raj was a far better coder than I was. And generally, like what my skill has been is being able to see a big picture, like macroscopic things. Was going back to being a visual learner, right? Being able to see the big picture and see how things connect and where things might be going. And then the other thing that I tended to be okay at was explaining complex things in simple ways. And that was largely what I did in grad school. Like, we would brainstorm on ideas, and sometimes it was Lori's idea, sometimes it was Raj's idea, sometimes it was my idea. And that was, but when it came to actually implementing it, Raj was wonderful at writing the code. And then the thing that I did well, and Lori was the tenure track professor who understood how like academia worked and could plug us into grants and knew how to do the network and so forth, and also had a wonderful simulation and computational statistics background. And then generally what I did was I was good at explaining these complex ideas to the general public. And the cool thing that I loved about public policy was that was a mandate. And it's an unusual mandate in academia, right? Because usually when you're publishing in academia, you're speaking to the 10 other people that care about that very precise topic. Yeah. And academic productivity tends to be reductionist in that you're constantly getting more honed into a more precise thing in order to be unique. But there was two tricks that and the thing that I loved about public policy was there was also a mandate of, in order to do research in public policy, there's the public half of it, right? Is you need to inform the public so they understand how to cast votes to make more informed decisions around policy. So there's this whole mandate of that you really want to be able to explain your research to the average person. So that one just resonated with where I thought there was value in academia. And part of where I had gotten disillusioned with geography becoming very postmodern. It's a fascinating construct, but nobody understands the vocabulary of postmodern critical theory outside of academia. So like you're just talking to each other, and there's always the risk of it becoming navel gazing, which where I loved about public policy is it kind of flipped that and said, all of this needs to go into informing the public. And that was something that I enjoyed. And also, I think as a result of enjoying it, I got better at it. And it just so ended up that in technology, that's also a really important skill to take a really complex set of computational things or mathematical things and go to the public, which is the market or investors, and explain to those things of why that's important to them, why it's impactful, and why it makes a big picture difference. So I think that ability to connect them was helpful, and especially early on when I was still a lot closer to the mathematics and I was actually doing them myself, that I understood how it worked under the hood, even though I might be really bad at debugging it. It allowed me to translate what that was to people that were interested in the outcome that computation or mathematics created. So that's kind of the thing I think that helped me succeed.
Yeah, so it's just like bringing the people together more than doing the implementation at a lower level.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're working on Zephr. Is that the third or fourth company that you started?
Fourth.
Fourth.
So, I made this joke at SAC Camp, but we were doing the business kind of business model, product market fit affinity group. And, and everybody was kind of talking about the things they had done introducing each other. And, kind of the joke is it's 4 exits, but they're all, or 3, they're all like base hits or bunts, to use like a bad baseball metaphor.
That does not speak to me.
So so I'm trying to think if there's like or I guess cricket wouldn't work out either, but
nope.
So so in the concept of baseball, right, you can hit a home run
mm-hmm.
where they throw the pitch and you hit it and it goes over the fence and you get to score. But the odds of hitting a home run statistically, and baseball is all about statistics, the odds of hitting a home run are quite low. And you can swing for the fences, and every once in a while you'll get lucky and hit one out of the park, right? And that's what venture capital is largely built around, is that they're going to take a whole bunch of chances, understanding that the vast majority are going to flame out. But a small percentage of those are going to be home runs. They're going to have huge outsized returns that make their fund. So like the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Snapchats, the Googles, the Meta Facebooks, these are the home runs. But for every home run, there's another 9 or 99 startups that fizzled and failed, right? But the returns on that home run are so big that that the funds work, and that's great for venture capital. It's not always necessarily so good for entrepreneurs, because in the process of trying to hit that home run, you end up burning through a lot of more sustainable business models that could have created a viable entity that just wasn't a home run. And so they end up folding in the process of trying to become a home run by trying to force the growth so rapidly that they get over too far extended, right? And you just run out of capital, even though you have a core business. The core business isn't growing fast enough to be a home run. And so I think, the thing that has kind of allowed us to be moderately successful is being very pragmatic about whether or not we have a home run. And a lot of this we learned in the first startup, because we screwed up so many things. And
so, sorry, let me interrupt you there. What you were saying about the whole analogy of the baseball is that this is the fourth one. You've had 3 exits, but none of them were the home runs, right?
Yeah,
that's okay.
So a base hit is like you just go to the first base, right?
Okay.
And the bunt's even a weirder thing, where instead of like trying to fully swing the bat, you just put it out there and just knock the ball down enough and hope that it takes them so long to run and get it that you can get to the base because you can run really fast.
Okay.
So it's like the wussiest way to advance possibly scoring.
I see.
And so we kind of joked that it's like, the minimally viable acquisition.
Okay.
In like, the most self-deprecating way possible. And so that's, I think our philosophy has been, especially after making so many mistakes in the first one, where we like grew the team up to almost 50 people and we had millions of dollars in revenue that was recurring. But when we finally sold the company after 7 years of work, the common shareholders, which are the employees and the founders, got none of it. And the investors got all of it. And we realized that, success is not necessarily given just by succeeding in the core business objective. That if you don't hit that home run, even if you do have a successful exit, a lot of times the people who actually did the work don't get to participate. And not that the investors don't do work, but it's a different kind of work, right? And we got a carve out, and it was okay, but for the amount of work, and it was really fun work. It was great. It was probably the most fun I ever had in any of the startups. But from a financial return, it was disappointing, right? And it was a rough kind of exit trajectory with a lot of bored soap opera and drama. And so kind of coming out of that, we kind of made this, realization that, not everything's a home run. And so when we start these ideas, oftentimes I think it's the classic trap of we get enamored with the technology or the mathematics, and it's just a fun problem we really want to solve. And sometimes those have, no market whatsoever. And it was a fun little side experiment that we played around with. But a lot of times, it takes some work to see if there is a market for it. And so we try to be very pragmatic about, in the process of doing that, especially as you bring in new team members and they're joining up to go on this journey with you, that you're very pragmatic about how do you make it worthwhile for them and how do you bring back value. And basically, not everything is going to be a venture funded home run. And a lot of what we tried to be was pretty ruthless with not drinking our own Kool-Aid, which is tough, right? Because when you go to pitch an investor, you have to convince them that it's going to be $1 billion opportunity. And the only way you can convince them if you believe that yourself. But not everything is $1 billion opportunity, but also not every business needs to be venture funded. And so with a lot of the, with the intermediate ones, we just did angel investing and, where the return expectation isn't as outsized.
So to just maybe add some context, VC is there's a pool of money and someone, it's not their money, but they decide where to allocate it. Mm-hmm. Angel investing is someone who was a founder maybe before who decided, okay, I'm going to invest my own money. So they maybe have higher stakes in the game and might invest differently than VC, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, exactly. VCs have limited partners and, they have a fund. That fund has a lifespan, maybe 7 to 10 years. And at the end of that fund, they expect a return, the limited partners do. And so depending on how well that portfolio performs, that can drive different decisions of what to do with those companies and how much you're willing to sell them for, or how aggressive you're going to push for a bigger valuation or a bigger exit. And we got caught up in the middle of that with our first startup. But angels are much more simple, to your point, right? Of that is most typically their money. Sometimes you get a pool of angels, but typically it's their own money. Many of them have made enough money that they don't care, and they're just investing to have an opportunity to work with other people and hoping some of those that do well. Others have, they might see it as complementary to their business, and they're just investing off the side of the business because they think there could be some strategic upside to it. But it's the expectation of returns aren't nearly as big, right? That they don't have a fiduciary responsibility back to a set of limited partners to do so. And so, and that's what we've done with all of our startups since, is we've started off with a small bit of angel funding, kind of the minimum amount we think we need to figure out if the product's viable or not. And then we go hard to work being as efficient with that capital as possible to see if there's a good outcome. And then depending on how good that outcome is, you decide if you want to raise venture capital or not. Is it a potential home run? Do you want to do venture capital? Or, this is a really cool niche and it could be a really nice feature for somebody else, or we've put together a really talented team that's really valuable in a market. And then you look for, another outcome that's better aligned. Or we're going to do a little products and little services so we can bootstrap and not have to take on venture capital. But it just gives you a lot more options, right? You're not stuck with having to do a massive exit to make somebody else's portfolio work. You can be much more pragmatic about it and saying, hey, this is another really cool team that I love and I'd love to go work with them. And there's a good fit. And, the amount that they're offering, while by TechCrunch standards isn't a massive exit, since we own 95% of the company, it's meaningful to everybody that's here, and their lives are going to be substantially different than they were before doing the startup. And that's a cool thing to do. Yeah,
it's really interesting. It's something that I've thought quite a bit about, and I find weirdly doesn't get talked about very often. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's just some weird nerding out thing and doesn't interest a lot of people, but I feel like it's interesting to look at a lot of the different models that companies can get funded, because if, in this space, if you want to start a satellite constellation company that's going to require hundreds of millions of dollars upfront before you've launched your first satellite, and that's how you actually make money, then there's pretty much only one option, which is venture capital. But then there's a lot of other things that don't need necessarily as much. And then there's the complete other opposite, which is bootstrap, which is like your own money.
Yeah.
And you might not have that much. And it's interesting to see what other options exist in the middle. So that's for some of the funding. How do you decide what to work on? So we've talked about the maps, and a lot of the different things that you've worked on are very geospatial heavy, but a lot of the topics are still pretty different. So that first one was around, what was it actually? Because it was around like the core competency was putting that data set together, if I understand correctly.
I mean, ironically, we pivoted pretty massively.
Okay.
And actually kind of a funny way, now that I've told the history of it, that we were trying to do this simulation modeling, and most of it was for like from a security perspective, like how do you counter a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, and how do you become more resilient? But we realized over time that was kind of a fear-driven decision, and once the fear of 9/11 began to wane, how many people wanted to continue to invest into that, and it just didn't feel good, and it also didn't seem right from a what kind of business value are you adding? But we noticed as we were building it that people really liked the mapping components that we were creating for it. And right around this time, Google Maps came out, and Keyhole got acquired. And first, it was Keyhole got acquired, and Google Earth came, and we'd been using Google Earth, and then they acquired an Australian company that became Google Maps, and that became available. And all of a sudden, everybody could see these map tiles, and we had been creating these analysis heat maps, like you see a lot now, these kernel density functions to show where there's a large agglomeration of points or polylines or something. And we're like, oh, it'd be so much cooler if we put like our heat maps on top of these new slippy tiles. And so we started hacking the app to see if we could pull the tiles, and that worked. And several other people were doing the same thing. And you kind of look around to see how they were hacking and pulling the tiles. Like, all right, we're going to hack and pull the tiles too. And so then we put our heat maps on top of it. And at the time, you'd run these heat maps in like ArcGIS, and it wrote a database, and each cell in the Kriging or kernel density function was written to a cell in the database. And so if you had like a 1,000 by 1,000 grid, you had that many data entries into your database. And so creating these things made like a 50 meg, 100 meg file if you're doing anything at reasonable scale. And so they just took forever to load. And we had this intern from Georgetown, Pramukta, who was a physics major, and he had done his previous internship at NIH working on ImageJ, which is like an electron microscope image processing software package. But it all works in pixel space. It didn't write to a database. He goes, why don't we just take this microscopy stuff and put it onto a map? Because it's the same mathematical function, just at wildly different scales. And they're like 50 kilobytes. And so we started making the heat maps into these small tiles that we could put on top of the map tiles that were also just really lightweight PNGs. And all of a sudden we could show these heat mapping functions on top of it. And so then we started just trying to find quirky data sets that we could heat map that we thought would be cool. And so we started writing blog posts with everybody in the company was like, go find a quirky data set that we can make a heat map of. And so we did a blog post about it, about what we did. And Dig, really dating myself, picked up on it.
Yeah,
you probably know what Dig is, right? So Dig was this like hot web 2.0 startup that was, kind of like Reddit before Reddit.
Yeah, that's what I imagined.
You would post like cool things you found on the web, and they would go viral, and people could comment on it. And in like 2005, 2000, this was like the hot thing coming out of the Bay Area. And there was a guy named Kevin Rose who had built it, who was kind of famous for like doing really hip, kind of cool startups. And Kevin Rose himself had picked up on our blog and posted it to Dig. And so it goes viral, and all these people are commenting it, and we're getting all these like hits on the website. And we realized that there was kind of this latent demand for doing cool things with maps now that Google had kind of unlocked it to the masses, and the masses wanted to do more than just look at push pins. And so that's when we made the pivot of looking at, what could we do on top of it? And so one side of it was, let's add some more cartographic tools on top of it. But the other one was like, we just had a lot of fun finding quirky data sets that we could download and scrape and putting them on a map. And we're like, dude, that was really fun. What if we just like let everybody scrape and add quirky data sets they find to the map. So we ended up kind of building this crowdsourced repository where anybody could upload whatever file formats you could have, back then, like shapefile and KML and CSV. And we had like a geocoder and a little spatial join function, and just made it really easy for people to find weird, fun, quirky data sets and upload them and share them. And then you could make maps with your data and other people's data, and there was a search. And back then, mashups was kind of the big thing. And so we just enabled this massive mashup factory for data, and people seemed to really like it. And I think we ended up with like 10 or 15 million maps, like 250,000 data sets, 150,000 users. So I mean, by like web scale, that's not big, but by like GS mapping scale, it was
also, that's like
big.
Still early 2000s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's also that context.
So, and that was our pivot, and then we raised money
Okay.
on that concept after kind of struggling before that, and we got some investors on board. After we did that with the University of Maryland Venture Fund, was kind of like back then it was called an A round, which is funny because like now that'd be like pre-seed money. But that was our A round, and then we raised another bigger round once we made that pivot and launched the new project.
Yeah, so I wanted to get back to that question of like how do you decide what are the things that you work in? It seems like no, that's really good context. That's really good context because that's very just serendipitous and opportunistic, which sounds like a bad thing sometimes, but it's really good. It's like, oh, you have an eye for it. So I think, I don't know what the second one, I know the third one and I know this one, but what was the second one?
Yeah, the second one was called Timbre, which was actually timbre for like tone quality in music.
Yeah.
But we could only get the domain TIMBR.
Okay.
We couldn't find one with the E. And then everybody pronounced it timbre. We just got tired of correcting them. So we just kind of called it Timbre. But Pramukta actually named it Timbre. So we joke around now when we run into it, we call it Timbre. And the funny thing is that idea kind of came out directly out of the work that we'd been doing at GeoCommons before that. So it ended up getting acquired by Esri after a bit of a roller coaster. And then at Esri, they wanted us to rebuild GeoCommons on Esri technology. So there was a group that went and did that. And
what was GeoCommons?
GeoCommons was the first startup, the crowdsourcing mashup thing.
Okay.
And so they wanted, that ended up becoming a thing called ArcGIS Data Hub that Andrew Turner, who was our CTO at the time, still runs to this day. And it's become a really successful part of Esri's product suite, which is really cool. And he did an amazing job continuing that on. And so they kind of told me, like, well, come up with a project and, for something new, because continuing the old one it was just a weird thing to go do.
Mm-hmm.
And so they told me I could just, try to come up with something. And so we'd been doing like event detection at the time, was kind of one of the last big contracts that we had with NGA, and we hadn't delivered on it. So we were still working on it. So the first thing I was doing is delivering this event detection map. And the concept there was like Twitter had added location to the Twitter API. And so you could add a lat long explicitly to Twitter. And Andrew, I was actually friends with a guy named Ryan Sarver, who was the product manager at Twitter at the time, who was doing that. And he asked Andrew if he could test it out. And so we got early access to this Twitter data with location on it. And it was just cool because you could put in a search term and see a map of tweets, which was at the time just really cool and kind of wild. And so we started thinking about like how we could use it. So we started tracking like current events and seeing how people reacted to current events. And then we were doing a lot of natural disaster work. And we noticed that people would go to social media to talk about how they were responding to a natural disaster. And they would say, oh, it's flooding or we've lost power. And so we started using that as like an early indicator to see how the public was responding to an event. And then as we began to work with NGA more, they were interested in, okay, if we're getting an indicator that it's flooding, is that just social media noise or is there something actually there? And so let's task the satellite to go image that spot. And then, we started thinking about, well, could you use like machine learning to detect flooding and that imagery so we could do it programmatically. And so the concept was, you would detect social media, tweets about flooding, then task a satellite go look to see if there was flooding happening in that area. And then if you could do that programmatically also, then that could trigger like a whole set of like early warning indicators to help people go and respond better at the end of the day. So there was a really wonderful group, Katie Balcom and Nat Walpert, or Katie Zezima now, who was running that and helping us work through all these social data things, which all the interesting is getting social data into the government so it could use social data and it wasn't considered domestic surveillance was another like huge wicket that we had to go through that Nat and Katie did a wonderful job navigating. But it was a really wonderful group. And so we got really excited about this idea. And so we went to Esri and said, hey, we think like, using machine learning on geospatial data could be really cool. It's nascent and new now, but we think maybe it could be big. And I think, largely because like right before this, there was this whole thing about like the ontological web was this big thing. And I was trying to think there was like a pithy word for it. Was supposed to be the next big thing. Okay. And a lot of people invested in it, and especially in geospatial, and it flamed out and nothing happened to it. And so like kind of on the heels of that flaming out, we came in and we're like, oh, machine learning, no, that's going to be the next big thing. And I think, and Ezra was kind of like, yeah, well, no. The funny quote from the meeting was like, no, that's Jedi mind tricks. That's not like, proper first principles engineering, which, given the history of fads that had come through, especially the ontological web that had just like kind of fizzled, totally made sense. Yeah. And so like, well, that didn't go anywhere. And so we're kind of, Pramukta and I had been working on it, and we're like, well, why don't we just go start a company and see if we can make this work? Because we were excited about it. Maybe there's something there. And Pramukta was just finished. He had gone back to Georgetown to get his PhD, and he had just finished. And so we're kind of waiting for him to defend, and picked up some contracts. And but the interesting thing was since we had been acquired by Esri and left, we had a non-compete that we couldn't do anything mappy or geospatial as a result, which is kind of one of these things sometimes that sneaks its way into acquisition agreements. So they don't want you to leave and go do it again. Totally makes sense. It's reasonable. So like, all right, well, we got to do non-map stuff, which was scary for me. So we ended up, we had been doing the work with the friends at Twitter. So we went back and said, hey, we're playing around with trying to do some of this event detection stuff. So we ended up doing some work with Twitter. And at the time they wanted more geographic data, because like the number of people that were geotagging their tweets is like 1 or 2% of all tweets. Actually, like people turn on their GPS data.
Yeah, because it's an opt-in thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And but just about lots of people put, I'm from Louisville. There's a thing in there like where you're from, and you put Louisville, Colorado. But a lot of people also say I'm in like Justin Bieber's heart, or I'm in hell. And then, most people run a geocoder, right? And if you run Britney Spears through the geocoder, if you run Justin Bieber through a geocoder, they think it's in Russia. And if you put, I'm in hell, there's a place called Hell, Texas.
Yeah,
and
so you
get all these false positives, right? And so it's this interesting like NLP, but also geospatial problem. So we worked on that with them. It was super fun. We learned a lot, but it wasn't like proper GIS, so it was okay, or at least we didn't get in trouble for it. Maybe somebody will hear this, and I'll hear from an Esri lawyer.
Sorry.
But and we really enjoyed that. And so we started doing, more work around natural language processing. But before like diving completely, because I can feel myself trying to tell several more really long stories, that the pithy summation is basically, in each previous startup, we get an idea that turns into the next startup.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting.
Yeah, it's like you're working on this problem, and you realize that this problem's not a fit for where you're at. And so a lot of times you put it on the shelf and say, I love that problem. It's really interesting. It doesn't make sense right now, but let's put it on the shelf with some other problems. And when there's an opportunity, let's go revisit that problem. Yeah. And every subsequent startup has been based on that exact thing, that there's something that, Pramukta or Chris Helm or Winnie or different people that we've worked together over the years, some problem that we come across, and we're like, oh, that's a cool problem. And then, when for whatever reason it's, there's an opportunity to shift to the new thing, we kind of go back to the shelf and we're like, well, what's a cool problem that we'd really love to work on next?
Interesting. I think what I've noticed as well, just, hanging out around you for the past few days and just hearing you talk right now as well, is it seems like the network of people who has just kept on growing over time, and that makes the ideas then possible as well, where you have this idea and you're like, oh, it seems like this person, that person, and this person could be the people for that, and kind of helping and timing things where you don't just come up with the idea and figure out, okay, I need to do everything. Like you
Hmm.
already seem like you know, either on the angel investing side of things, like if you know people, it's probably a lot easier of a relationship, but also people that you hire, you work with. I think some of the people you work with today, you've already worked with in the past. I feel like it's very different from, we're going to raise a lot of money from maybe people we don't know and hire a lot of people, meaning we don't know all the people that come in. It's a lot smaller. It's a lot more intentional. At least that's the sense that
Hmm.
I'm getting.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of kind of putting that thing on the shelf, and it's funny because like if I look, we've kind of set up, we have Pramukta set up this like alumni Slack. Like on that Slack channel, you can see like GPS Plus and like literally like the next startup being a channel that we started at one point to discuss the next thing.
Yeah.
Um, the cool thing is by the time we get to the next thing, we've already been discussing it for a while.
I see.
So like the idea gets a bit baked and tested, and you still don't really know until you actually start. But I think it really helps us, thinking through and having a long time to kind of gestate and marinate it before kind of jumping in, and instead of like a whiteboard of here's all the
What
things
can
the
we do
next
now? Yeah.
is always seems like I've tried doing that a few times, and it doesn't feel as productive. But this just worked for us. I didn't, for whatever reason.
Yeah, so from the outside looking in, it might look like, oh, you're just throwing stuff,
Yeah,
but it's been a slow, like we were also just condensing like 30 years into
yeah.
a couple hours.
Yeah, I should also say that the vast majority of these ideas end up not being mine.
Yeah.
And it was funny at SAT camp. I was talking to somebody, and they're giving me a nice compliment about like the different ideas and startups and stuff. And Bill Greer was standing there, and he's worked on several of these with us. And it was funny. He goes, "Yeah, Sean's really bad at taking compliments." And I was like, "Yeah, because it wasn't me. Like, I didn't come up with these. Most of these ideas I did not come up with. Like a few things here and there, but not the majority of them. No, it was somebody else on the team. But since I end up being the face of it, largely because I'm the worst coder, and I'm the one out there interacting with people, I end up getting credit for it, but it doesn't feel correct."
Yeah. So can you tell me about Zephr, like what you guys are doing now and kind of how we got there?
Yeah, so very similar. We had this really kind of ambitious idea with Pixelate Earth of let's create a perpetually updating
Which is
3D.
startup number 3.
Yeah, sorry. Create a perpetually updating map of the world.
No big deal.
And yeah, not hard. We're mildly delusional at times too, but that's healthy in its own weird way. And we thought we could do this with crowdsourcing. And I think it's actually been a common theme across all of our startups, the extent of like we just love crowdsourcing, the idea of engaging with the public and getting them to participate. And some of that was like that public policy background, citizen science was a part of that. And that's always been really intriguing. The crowdsourcing that we did with GeoCommons was kind of the underpinning principle of it. The being involved with OpenStreetMap in the early days, superficially, and just it's always just seemed like a cool mechanic, and it's something that we've been excited about. We've tried to bring in some way or another to each of the startups. It's probably along with mapping, is probably one of the kind of other underlying common themes of everything. And if you want to perpetually update a map of the world, having industrial vehicles driving around and doing that is a really expensive way to pull it off. And if you look and like kind of crunch the numbers on how often Google updates Street View, even with spending billions of dollars, and you do even like a basic systematic analysis of when was the last time, so they put like the last time the Street View imagery was updated, right? Is even with spending billions of dollars, is thoroughly insufficient to have a perpetually updating map of the world. And it's still kind of TBD of how often you need to update. I don't think anybody quite knows that yet because we don't have enough autonomous things or AR things running in the real world to know. Google probably has a better sense than anybody right now with Live View having been running for a while. But regardless, I think, everybody kind of saw crowdsourcing. If you can get all the people that are out there anyways taking videos to update the map as data exhaust off of what they're doing anyways, that's the ideal thing to do. And so similarly, we wanted to try that concept out. And we were inspired by like what Mapillary had done with Street View imagery, and obviously inspired by OpenStreetMap and what they had done. And so we're kind of, we thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity for doing this for 3D. Could we do this 3D map of the world? And so we had ideas around dual licensing also, which was really interesting. And we had like one of the lawyers from Mapillary that Janine Young connected us with, who helped us write a dual license similar to what Mapillary did, but kind of specific to what we were doing. And the idea was that, if you uploaded some of the video, or there's, we connected into the network to create the video, that we would create a 3D reconstruction, and that would be free, openly licensed, public domain kind of thing. And then the feature database that you use for AR and autonomy, we would get a license for, like, perpetual royalty-free license kind of thing. And then you have this kind of quid pro quo. It's like, you give us the data, we give you a 3D model, and then you let us go do some perpetually updating 3D map of the world for interesting deep tech things. And so you were one of our first ambassadors for trying to get people to go out and map that. And the simple thing, and what we really wanted to do, was to allow people to just use their mobile phones, right? It was like with the ambassadors, we were basically sending GoPro 360s out to everybody because that did the best job. And it was because we couldn't get the cell phones to work. We could kind of get them to work if it was open sky, but if you get into an urban area, there's just too much GPS drift. Which is also part of the reason that, we kind of looked at selling early, that, if you can't do it on phones, then can you really crowdsource? Are there enough GoPro users? Can you buy enough GoPros? We looked at like building hardware, like, and it's really cool because that's what HiveMapper is doing. Like they've built their own, to drive down this cost, and they pay people to go around and drive and collect this imagery.
And then it's closer to the Street View model.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But not as much the 3D model. I think actually they did some 3D stuff, but I think they found the more traditional. Because again, the big elephant is like, the AR market just hasn't emerged, and neither has the autonomy market. So another reason that we kind of sold early was we just couldn't see a line of sight on when the market would be there to sell more to other than these big tech companies. So that was kind of the motivation for Zephr, was when we went to Snapchat, and we were like, well, they got brilliant engineers, wonderful computer vision people, wonderful maps team. Maybe they figured out this GPS thing, but they hadn't. We'd done some work with Meta, and they had some really cool crutches to get around it, but it's expensive and difficult and kind of pain in the ass. Similar, Niantic has their own kind of crutch to get around it by just doing it around points of interest. So it's like all these snow globes, but once you leave the snow globe, it's hard. And so we just, saw that nobody really solved this problem. And at one point when we were doing a contract for one of these folks, we were on their campus, and they had asked us to rent an RTK differential GPS system to do ground truth, because we were doing visual positioning. So we were, it was cool because we always said, hey, we have this way to build these 3D models cheap, and the compute's really cheap, and you can use commodity hardware to collect it. And they're like, awesome, but can you run a visual positioning system against it? We're like, I think so, yeah. We're like, all right, do it. So we went and built, a visual positioning system to prove that the base data would work.
So just off the cameras.
Yeah, yeah. Right? So like a visual positioning, you're using the camera to orient you instead of the GPS. So you usually use the GPS to cheat, to know where in the database to look. But with your background in photogrammetry, when you're doing photogrammetry, you're looking at multiple 2D photos, and you're looking for pixels in common that are overlapping between two photos. You might take a picture of something at one angle, 45 degrees different. You have a different angle, but you can still see that corner of the house in both photos. And so that pixel of the corner of the house is common to both photos, but it's been taken at two different angles. And so you can use that to then triangulate back, and you get enough of those key features, then you can use a whole bunch of 2D photos to make a 3D reconstruction. But the cool thing is that usually then you fill in all the holes, other than the common pixels or key points. and that's like the hard part to get a really nice looking reconstruction. But the other cool thing you can do with that same database of features or key points is that you can use it as a visual reference to do location. So you open up the camera on your phone when you're in live view, it looks at the house, and then if it sees that pixel in the corner, and then it looks into its database and it finds that same pixel in the corner, then it knows where it is, where that one is. It finds a couple of more. It can triangulate and locate where you are.
More accurate than your GPS on your phone can today.
In an urban area, especially.
Right. Yeah, because GPS gets occluded or
it bounces around and you get big errors. But since you're just doing it visually, the GPS bounce from the satellite doesn't affect you. But you still generally use GPS because if you have a massive feature database and you're trying to search that whole database to find that matching key point, it's a huge search problem. But if you know roughly where you are by GPS, then you can just look at a small part of the database, right?
Because you just need. You were doing a presentation the other day, and I think it's like 3 to 5 meter or 5 to 10 meters. The current accuracy of a standard GPS on your phone.
Yeah, it's like 3 to 5 meters in open sky.
Right.
And some people can get below that, doing some tricks to it. But generally, most people's phones are around 3 to 5 meters.
Yeah, but the point is, you don't need to know where in the world you are. You need to know where in those 20 meters or something.
For the visual positioning.
So you start Pixel 8. You realize consumer smartphones aren't accurate enough, even outdoors, to do what you wanted to do. And so you kind of put that problem on a shelf. Is that right? And then you get acquired by Snap and then decide that's the new problem. So that's how we get to where we are today, trying to get more accurate GPS location, but based on of a smartphone.
Yeah, exactly. You put it in far fewer words than I did, so thank you. So my academic tendencies come out in these. Academics love to just ramble.
So can you tell me how that works? And then the other question is, what's the business model? Yeah,
no, definitely. Both very good questions. So the concept of what we're doing that's different, but there's a lot of ways you can prove GPS or GNSS. So good point on there. GPS being the American constellation, and the thing we're actually talking about is actually GNSS. Yes, it's very ethnocentric to call everything GPS, but it's just if you tell people GNSS, they don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. But most people know what GPS is. But GPS is just one constellation. It's the American constellation that happened to be first. But then the EU launched Galileo. The Russians have GLONASS, the Chinese have Baidu, the Indians have their own local one that they're going to make global soon. So there's multiple constellations that you can tap into, and all those constellations are GNSS, and each one has its own name, but GPS is the one that the public understands.
But in super basic terms, what you're trying to do is improve the accuracy of that blue dot on your map.
Yeah, it's like the classic problem, like you get out of the metro or the subway,
and it has no idea where
that blue dot's floating all over the place, trying to figure out where it is, and it does finally land, and it's like on the wrong block, and then you're trying to figure out which way to walk, and and it causes all sorts of misadventures in histrionics. And the nice thing with this problem is just about everybody's experienced like GPS gone wrong, or GNSS gone wrong, and so it's really nice to a lot of times, like with like imagery based things, most people don't personally relate to the problem that you're solving a lot of times. But nice thing with GPS is just about all of us have had a personal experience with it. And so basically the way that we're trying to solve it is there's kind of two kinds of GPS if you think about it from a really basic scale. And that's the consumer GPS that's on your watch or your phone that gives you the blue dot. And then there's surveyor GPS, where you see somebody out with a tripod with an antenna on it. And while that antenna is definitely way better than the antenna in your phone, it's not really what makes survey GPS, 1 to 2 centimeter accurate.
Okay.
It's there's a network of base stations around the world. In the U.S., it's called the CORS network that's run by NOAA. And those base stations are fixed, and they have a super precise signal. And basically what you do in surveying GPS is that you reach out over the internet to one of these base stations, and it gives you an error correction based on its super precise signal. So then you have two measurements. Those two measurements can cancel out the error between them and get it down to that very accurate location.
Okay. Why does my smartphone not do that?
Well, for a long time, there was a couple of problems. One, the base stations aren't everywhere. So a lot of times, surveyors set up their own base stations. So like Camilla gave a wonderful talk about the survey work she did in Vermont at Sat Camp. And basically a lot of times you're out in the Vermont woods and you don't have a cellular connection and you can't connect to one of these base stations. So you need to be within 10 kilometers of one. And so they set up their own base station, but you have to sit there for like 30, 45 minutes to get a really precise signal. So like these things are
it's not usable for
very portable or dynamic, right? And also the quality of the receiver on the phone is not very good. And so if you just bring in an error correction to the phone, that's been challenging. Well, actually, recently Trimble did an announcement of working with Xiaomi and Qualcomm, where there's a Trimble correction service for one of their really high-end phones with this latest Qualcomm Snapdragon processor on it, and they were able to get to a meter of accuracy, which is really cool. I think it was like back in April they announced it. So people have been trying to do this for a while, and actually Google made the full metadata to do this available about 4 or 5 years ago, and they started a Kaggle challenge around it. So you need a thing called like the carrier phase data, the pseudo range data, these kind of raw measurements of the distance of the satellite or the signal time and distance. But you need to calculate a distance from that, which is the really hard part. And so there's the whole Kaggle challenge where people have been trying to improve on that baseline. And they've improved on it, but kind of incrementally. I think like 1.5 meters roughly is kind of where the Kaggle challenge ended up. And some of those are post-processing and
standard Kaggle.
Yeah, it's like it's not production, right? You're doing things that you just can't really quite replicate. And so that's kind of where Pramukta came in with this really kind of ingenious idea. Going back to when we rented this differential GPS and we're trying to get it to work, and we're sitting on the campus of this big tech company, and it was before the pandemic, and it's lunchtime. We're trying to get the in trip to connect to the base station, and we're kind of noobs and not really sure what to do, and we're frustrated. And Pramukta kind of looks up as we're mucking about on it, and everybody's walking around looking on their phone. He's like, "Why don't we just make everybody's phone a base station? Instead of having one super precise signal from this really fixed place, what if we just had a big sample of mediocre signals and we just put it into a big ensemble and try to get it to converge on reality?" Which is a lot of what we were doing with Pixelate, right? Of like we were taking all these pixels and we're taking aerial LiDAR and these rough GPS signals and trying to get it all to converge to a 3D map that meets reality. And the cool thing with Pramukta's background is in condensed matter and statistical mechanics out of physics, which is all about using large, robust statistical analysis tools to get things to converge on reality. And so basically you have these ideas that, these techniques we're using from computer vision and statistical mechanics, could we go and apply that to GPS? Because GPS traditionally has always been, one receiver getting signals from a dozen satellites, let's say, or one correction coming in. But what if we turned it into a mass computational problem? Again, where we're crowdsourcing and getting measurements from a whole bunch of phones and using that to get the mesh of devices to converge on reality. And we got really excited about the math around that because it's super fun and cool. And so we started playing around with it. And then, similarly, we're like, oh, we got to deliver this project for this big tech company. Let's put it on the shelf. Otherwise, we're never going to deliver this, whether or not this VPS works. And so then we that's the one that we pulled off the shelf when we left Snap back in September.
Right. So I think that idea is really exciting, but there's been a couple things in the back of my mind, which is how do you convince people to use that? Because then if it's on a phone, like this works, I'm guessing, better as there are more people that join. It's kind of a network effect.
Yeah, totally.
So if you're on your own, you're kind of stuck with your own receiver. But if you've got 20 people around you, but you need those 20 people to be a part of it as well. how do you make that happen? Now it's not a technical problem anymore,
Hmm.
assuming you can make that technical part work. Now you've got a community problem on your hands.
Yeah, a
Problems might not.
trust problem.
Yeah, there's how do you solve that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big things we started pondering from day one was, how do we make this safe? How do we preserve privacy? How do we become good citizens and stewards around this? So, GPS and GNSS has wonderful applications that have been, you know, very have a good societal benefit. But, there's also been lots of really important, hard-hitting articles about how, location, ruins people's privacy and it gets scraped and it gets sold on the gray market. And there's a lot of, kind of negative externalities and a gnarly underbelly. And we'd actually done a project on kind of like the dirty underbelly of location data and how it's used and being misused for, things like human trafficking and
Yeah.
things along those lines. So it was kind of very close to home for us, based on the work we had done of seeing bad things that happen and, and thinking about, how do we not contribute to that at a minimum and hopefully make it better, ideally. And so that was one of the first things we went into with Zephr is like, how do we architect this to preserve privacy? And so one of the good things is, the core metadata that we need to do this, the carrier phase data, the pseudo range data are all satellite measurements, right? And so that's really what we needed for folks to contribute from the phone are those raw GNSS measurements, of the satellites and the ephemeris coming off of them and the timing and the signal properties. And then we can feed that into a server, to do an optimization. And the cool thing is that what that optimization comes out with is an error correction. And then with the error correction, we said, well, the simple thing would be to just, to calculate the location on the server with the error correction and then broadcast the location back to the user. But at that point, you're centralizing a whole lot of people's location and you're broadcasting it, which is also could be a bit iffy if somebody intercepts it. And so we started thinking about it like, well, we don't need to broadcast it or do it on the server. We could send the error correction, which is totally benign, and then the person's phone locally could use the error correction to resolve their location. And then the location's just on their phone, right? And, technically you could reverse engineer the metadata or use the priors to get the user's location. So there we're like, well, we just hold it in memory for the calculation, and then it gets wiped to make room for the next set that comes in. And that way there's no way to go back and reverse engineer the metadata to try to figure out the location. And so between the two, we started to feel good about, there's no way that, let's say we start the company and we get run out of town and then somebody goes in and says, oh, look at this metadata, let's go reverse engineer it, right? So we didn't want to leave kind of those opportunities to exploit the system down the road. You never know what can happen with the company, right? And so, all right, if we keep it only in memory, then there's no trace left behind. And if we're only sending an error correction, then the only thing that knows the location is the device. And then it's, with the device, it's the relationship that's already been built between the app provider and the user as to how that data is used. So if you're comfortable sharing your data with Strava and you want that data saved, then you've built that relationship and we don't get in the middle of it.
Right. So that kind of answers the question. So this is not something where you're asking the individual user to install another app.
Correct.
This would be your customers are the Stravas of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I see. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, so you're, and the nice thing is they already have the networks, right? Because one of the things of this is you need kind of at least 3 people within 10 kilometers of each other to get, to kind of hit our accuracy targets. But the nice thing is there's lots of applications out there that on average have 3 users within 10 kilometers of each other. And so, those are the early customers we hope will adopt or test and pilot the things that we're doing. And the nice thing is, at least on the discussions we have, is, those are the folks that run into some of the most pernicious GPS problems, right? The classic, your Uber or Lyft or your Grab or your Ola shows up on the wrong block. And then you're on the phone with them and they're trying to come around to meet you. And it was funny, we were talking to one of the rideshare companies and they were saying, for every second that we can improve a pickup for a rider or a drop off for a delivery of food, we make another $1.5 million per year.
That's
Because
insane.
there's so many drivers, right, out there. And for every time
Yeah,
that they're having to lap that block or go to the other side of the road, or they can't find you because your GPS has drifted off,
right.
they could be doing another pickup, right? They could be doing another drop off. And those economies just add up over time. So the logistical optimization, even a small one can be a big improvement.
I see.
But if you can make a big improvement, then potentially that can be a really large delta from an economic perspective.
So it's kind of like improving that last mile. Well, no, actually, last few meter.
Yeah, sometimes
Yeah,
depends on how
yeah.
bad the GPS is, right? As to how far
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is
yeah,
off.
that's right. It's not just improving just a few meters, but it's especially in urban areas where a lot of the
Hmm.
lifts happen and a lot of the food deliveries happen. That's where the bigger errors are.
Yeah, exactly.
I
It's
see.
like the error is worst where the accuracy is most important,
I see.
and where the density of your users is most concentrated. And that's the other thing, we say 3 to 5 meters is like the open sky best result. In most GNSS companies, that's what they advertise their open sky because it's constant, right? But it's also the best case scenario.
I see.
And it's hard to quantify the worst case scenario because like, which one do you use, right? And how does everybody use it? But like, there's some really great studies where you go through and it'll have like the open sky result, and then you have the average result, and then you have the max error. And you look through these max errors. There's a great one where like they drove through Paris from like the suburbs into the city and then back out to like the rural areas. It's like 70, 80, 100 meters on the max error. And going through all these different devices. And these are the ones where we have our GNS GPS nightmares, right?
I
Of
see.
where you get lost or somebody drives into a river and all these weird things happen because that you hit that max error, right? And we never remember all the times GPS was right. We remember the time that was horribly 80 meters off, and things didn't end up the way that you wanted them to.
Do you have advice for people who are or want to start things as well? Like you've done a lot of stuff, you're still doing a lot of things. You've started companies. It seems like again you're very intentional. Like that's one of the things that like I'm taking away from, spending time with you in this conversation is really how much you've thought about not just the tech. You're clearly not just thinking about the tech, but you're also thinking about how big do we make the company and how small do we keep it and how do we fund it and who the people are. There's a lot, and I'm curious if you have advice for people who, might be listening or are thinking about starting things, maybe people in academia or people who are working at a company.
Yeah, I think probably the most simple advice is, and probably the most important factor of success is the team. Um, and I think, a lot of companies fail because founders make it too much about themselves. A lot of companies fail because of conflicts between founders. It's like you need to leave your ego at the door. Um, and the quality of the team that you build around you is, I think, probably the biggest determinant of success, right? There's a lot of luck. You have the right time at the right idea, but a lot of times the timing's wrong. A lot of times the idea's wrong, but a team can help you adjust to all of that, right? If you have a good team, they can help you figure out that that's not the right idea, or it's not the right time, or we need to go in this new direction, or this is the right market. Like when we started Zephr originally, we'd been having some talks about potentially spinning Pixelate back out of Snap, and so we really focused on this AR use case. And so I was doing all this kind of business planning, but we could do it with Nerf and add in the GPS stuff and the crowdsourcing. We could do the professional 3D map of the world. And Pramukta was like, why did we sell early? It's like, is the AR market we're going to emerge? It's like, so when's it going to emerge? Like, it's going to be longer than I thought 2 years ago, right? And so it was a good reality check of that wasn't a good market right now, and we still don't know if that's going to be a good market. Someday we hope it's going to be a good market, but let's not start another company chasing the same market
Mm,
that we failed at and didn't mature, and we ended up not raising venture money and selling early. And so it was awesome because it really kind of drew us back and said, well, let's look at GPS much more broadly and think about it. But that's like the power of the team, right? Left to myself, I can get obsessive about things and like, I really want to solve this problem, right? But that's the benefit of a team, right? They pull you back and help adjust, and fill in the gaps, right? And so if there's one thing that can help you succeed time and time again, it's having a really good team around you.
How do you get a good team?
It's kind of a running joke of I think the job as a founder is to make yourself the dumbest person on the team. That you should be constantly hiring somebody that's going to do that job better than you could do it. And I think it's a really good framework to think about the type of person that you want, and also think a really good way to think about how you manage that person. And I think those two things become really integral to a team. And that, a really key thing for success in a startup is that people need to be able to carry their own water, that they need to be productive on their own and enjoy being self-sufficient. But in order to get that kind of person that's going to own the thing and run with it and being super productive, is that you need to give them the room to do so. And I think, when you hire that person, they need to come in with the understanding that, hey, you're owning this thing, right? You're doing the back-end server infrastructure. And there's not somebody, you can't say, Susie didn't help me or Bob didn't help me, or, it's like you have to have somebody that's not looking for excuses why something gets done. It's like they want to own the thing, but they also want to be accountable and responsible for it.
Back to some trust.
Yeah. And vice versa, you as the manager need to realize that they're going to know that thing way better than you ever are. And if you come in and trying to tell them how they should do that thing and micromanage, or just be like, oh, you're wrong, it should be this, then that relationship's never going to work out. Because the type of person you need to go in and own something and really execute on that thing is not the kind of person that you can micromanage and constantly be correcting and telling what to do and be on top of. And I think that's, really builds the team's trust, right? Of that, if you're on the team, I trust you explicitly to do your thing and deliver on it. And vice versa, you trust me to give you top cover and give you resources to make sure that thing gets done, right? And so top cover is kind of more important in bigger companies, but it can be important in little companies, right? Because, investors want to get updates. They want to know why things haven't been done. And it can be easy to just go blame engineering, right? But that's not your job. Your job is to make sure that engineering has top cover in the room they need to execute on what they're doing. And resources, right? That's the other thing that can cause you to fail, is that, I've given you ownership and I've given you top cover, but there's no way humanly possible you're going to get all the things done, right? I've given you too ambitious of a project. It's just not feasible. And then you buckle under the pressure of trying to solve or do an unrealistic thing for the capabilities that you have. So that's the other big job on my end, building a team, is make sure you have enough resources to do your thing. And we've definitely pushed this to the limits on some startups where, we're bootstrapping and we have more people with too much work and we're not making enough money and it gets awkward. And that's the other thing, right? Of knowing, having a feel for striking that balance, right? Of we needed to raise enough money to make sure people are comfortable, and resourced enough, but not raising and spending so much that you lose that need to be efficient, and you bring on too much capital, which can cause problems also. So, and all these things go into, it's really all scaffolding and framework for building a team, right? Because the funding's purpose is to make sure you have the resources to build a team to execute the thing. But if the team isn't good and you haven't built trust and you don't have accountability, and you don't have camaraderie, then all this stuff falls apart so quickly. And so I think, it all kind of comes back to that in different ways, to pulling it together successfully.
I think a lot of the teams that you've had recently as well were relatively small. Was that because of, you talked about Pixel 8 earlier and wanting to get acquired early, meaning company doesn't have the time to become a huge 1,000 people. But you also mentioned earlier in the conversation, this notion of small teams. Is that something that you also gravitate towards, the ideas that have smaller teams, or is it because the projects that you've been involved in are at the earlier phases where it is smaller?
Usually it's very pragmatic as far as, there's, some of these engineering aphorisms that a 2-pizza team or a 1-pizza team, right? Being ideal for productivity. And there's definitely truth in that, right? With the right number of people focused on a specific project, you can be incredibly productive. Although it can be difficult to scale that once you actually have customers, then you need more people and more support. But again, we just try to be like ruthlessly pragmatic about that of what's the right number of people for the thing that we need to do today. And then, and the nice thing is that the market kind of reinforces these things, right? If you're going on the right track, you're going to get contracts and you're going to get customers, and that'll give you more revenue, which allows you to bring on more people. And so where you have to be careful is where the market's not giving you the feedback, but you're growing anyways.
Yeah.
And that's where people kind of tend to get into trouble of, kind of growing before, the ephemeral product market fit. And finding that balance. Sometimes you need to get a little ahead because sometimes it's a really hard engineering problem, like building satellites. You can't wait for product market fit before you launch, right? So that one's particularly hard. And depending on how deep your technology is, there's, the amount of forward investment you need to do differs. Like the GPS one, we've raised venture capital for this where we, haven't on the last two. And a large of that is driven by the fact that this is a really hard problem. It's a harder mathematical problem, and then also a bigger infrastructure than the stuff that we had been doing previously. And so we needed a little bit of a bigger team and a little bit more time before going to be ready to work with customers. And so, it's all kind of, some of these things you kind of get a feel for over time. But there's also just some basic principles around it of, trying to be judicious with how you spend capital. I think that's one thing where like being a grad student and an entrepreneur are really well aligned.
Because your overhead is so low.
Well, no, you're so poor when you're a grad student,
Yeah.
right? Is you figure out how to be efficient, like where the free buffet is, and how do you like pick up some side gigs, and like, how do you get by on not enough money in a big city, right? And startups, you should treat the same way. I think it's easy to get lured into, VC and the pitch and the high of getting a valuation and getting the return. But, even after having raised money, I still like keep my grad student mindset of like, what's the most efficient way we can do this? Not to the point that you make bad decisions, but just always being conscious of cost, because it's really easy to, once that money's in the bank, to start burning it. And a lot of times the investors want you to burn the money because they want you to get to a conclusion as to whether or not it's going to be a home run or not as fast as possible.
I see.
And so there's oftentimes pressure to spend more money soon. They give you capital. I want you to put that capital to work. But you want to put that capital to work as smartly as possible. And thinking like a grad student, like, where's your next meal going to come from, I think is a healthy way to think about it.
Maybe on a slight tangent, when do you think the AR market is going to get to the point where you thought it would be, a few years earlier?
Yeah, I think when there's a viable headset.
Okay, so it's on the headsets.
Yeah, like nobody wants to hold a phone up to their head, right?
Do you think Apple has a shot at it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think, as much as anybody, they've invested in heavily. I think they're also well incentivized of they need to figure out what comes after the iPhone. And so that's, the people who solve that will continue to dominate the industry, which I think also why, Facebook and or Meta, as much as the metaverse took a lot of heat, it's still, probably the most likely next generation of computing. But I think what we've all discovered over the last couple of years, who've been working in it, even those who haven't been working in it, is just those problems for creating a viable headset are just much harder than we thought 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's one of these classic things. Matthew Ball has a great essay where he kind of breaks down like all of the challenges to get an AR headset, kind of how collectively as an industry we've all discovered how difficult those things are, whether it's battery life, like waveform optics and getting those to work effectively, doing the 3D mapping to enable AR, that all these things are really hard problems, and there's like a dozen of them. Right? And I think it's one of these things you have to invest enough money to get deep enough into the problem to really understand how big the problem is. And, billions of dollars have gone in. And, the upside is we understand the problem way better. The downside is it's much harder than I think we all thought it was going to be 3 years ago. And so now that we actually know more and we've advanced more, but we've realized that we're probably a decade out. Who knows? Everybody can kind of make up a number, but
I like these predictions sometimes. It's fun.
But they're seriously hard physics-based problems.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change the fact that that it's still probably the most likely next mass computation interface for people. I don't know where you necessarily go otherwise. But maybe we'll be surprised, right? That's the wonderful thing about technology, is there could be some crazy ass thing that some kid in his garage comes up with that nobody has imagined, and she gets that out, and it totally changes our mind on all of this, and we were wrong. But at least, based on what I see today, that kind of seems the likely trajectory.
I like rounding these off, asking for a book and a podcast recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be about anything we talked about, but just things that you come across, thought were interesting and might be worth people's time. There's two reasons why I asked those. First is a lot of these travel through word of mouth a lot, compared to YouTube videos or things like that. Like, it's still, there are a little bit of Goodreads and Amazon have recommendation stuff, but it's still very, very limited. Most people discover books and podcasts through word of mouth. So I like hearing about new stuff. And then I think it's just interesting to see where people's minds go and what they look for. So is there a book, and if you listen to podcasts that you've come across recently that you think is interesting?
Yeah, I've been trying to think, like the podcasts are, I don't know if there's like any one. Like, there's a couple that I really enjoy, but they're probably ones that most people listen to. So it's probably not a great recommendation. But like, I love Radiolab, just for like the experimental nature and the novel stories that come out of it, and just thinking about, it always has a bit of a scientific bent, but it's something I probably wouldn't look at or come across normally on my own. Like Hard Fork for just like tech humor.
I think I've heard of none of those, so that's great.
So yeah. Radiolab is like out of New York Public Radio. It's been around for quite a while, and they cover all sorts of science-based topics, but they come at it from a very general audience perspective and make it fun and interesting. Hard Fork is a New York Times podcast with a New York Times tech reporter and an independent tech reporter that kind of just talk about the latest tech stuff in the news for like an hour once a week. But they're funny and interesting, and they just make, they talk a lot about generative AI because that's the latest thing, or the latest dumpster fire at Twitter. But they always have like some inside scoop, but are also like hilarious just in the way they discuss it, and it's just a fun way to laugh at the end of the week, which is good because you need to laugh at that because it's kind of absurd. So it keeps you grounded, right? You just kind of realize how stupid and silly a lot of the things that sometimes we get too serious about on. But still, you learn about new stuff also. That one's great. Those are probably the two main ones. The New York Times Daily is great just to keep up on the news and kind of go in depth to a story every day. So those are usually the ones I try to listen to in the morning before I start work.
Do you read a lot?
Yeah, probably more than is healthy, maybe.
Okay.
Although I feel bad because like I feel like I should be reading like deep introspective things, but mostly I just like fantasy escapist literature because it has little to do with what I work on a regular basis. But I like stories with a lot of moral ambiguity in it to help, because it's kind of a useful framework to think through complex situations you come to on a daily basis, but completely abstracted out. And kind of the more complex and deep and dark, the better. But there's a series of books called the Malazan Book of the Fallen. There's like 10 novels. It's like classic fantasy escapist literature by a guy named Stephen Erickson that I really enjoyed. And then, I think, more standard, like a Neil Stevenson Snow Crash, as far as just striking home for a lot of the stuff that I work on a day-to-day basis, right? That was the inspiration for Keyhole, which became Google Earth, and the idea of the librarian that has this compendium of all knowledge, concepts of the metaverse. Also, like dystopian realities of capitalism is super fascinating in that novel. So there's a lot of like really cool themes, but I feel like a lot of people talk about that book. So it's, but it is one that I think about a lot from when we're working on stuff of like, because there's interesting privacy and surveillance implications in that, of what happens with like with a corporatized state. And a lot of things that, for a book that was written in the 90s are incredibly relevant now. And so I think about that one a lot as like I work on stuff. But I feel like that's a little, like a lot of people kind of reference that book.
Sean, this has been great. I'm glad we finally got to do this.
No, thank you. It's been fun. Been great getting to spend time together with Sat Camp and then this.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for taking the time for making this available to the community. It's such a good resource. And it was great, like when we were at Sat Camp and they're like, what podcast to recommend? They're Mine's Behind the Map. So it's definitely something that's resonating with the community, I think, which is awesome. So, and also I think some of the best production value, especially for something niche like this, it's just awesome to see something come up that talks about the stuff that we work on that has such a high level of production, right? It's just like, it's like cool. It's like, yeah, this like helps people understand what we do, which is great.
Someone smart I know said sometimes you got to be a little delusional and optimistic. Sean, thanks a lot.
Thank you.